Hey y'all, Producer Drew here. I'm giving Ray a little break this month to recover from the big party that was our 1-year anniversary. But don't worry, because we have plenty of fun surprises coming up for our 2nd year, so keep an ear out for that. But this month, I'll be bringing you a story that I found personally interesting. Just no one tell Ray I'm recording without him, okay? Sigmund Abeles was not a name I was familiar with prior to working at the Columbia Museum of Art. I was actually first introduced to him, funnily enough, by our own YouTube channel.
To curate a show, you have to go into the guts of a museum, and this is the only museum whose guts I've ever gone into.
Mr. Abeles was tapped to curate the exhibition, An Artist's Eye, at the museum way back in 2011. Comprised of 80 works of the CMA's collection, this exhibition was chosen based on his own personal taste.
Everything in this show nourishes me. It's what I would buy, it's what I would hang, it's what I would trade for, what I would steal. It's just an overview of what was held in Columbia Museum of Art that I think is rich and exciting and meaningful, the best of what I want to find in art.
In the video, he comes off as likable, warm, charming, just the kind of guy you'd like to get to know. After the renovation of the building, I got my first taste of Sig's work here in person, when a painting of his was installed in the CMA collection galleries. The painting depicts the artist's mother at her stove in prayer over a Sabbath meal she's preparing at that moment. Behind her is a small figurine-sized version of the artist's father, also standing in prayer on top of the refrigerator. I found the moment depicted to feel quite isolating, with each figure turning their back to another, this feeling compounded by the work's title, Mom, Dad, Worlds Apart. Then I read the label next to the painting. When Abeles was a child, his parents separated. He and his mother moved to Myrtle Beach while his father remained in New York. While this painting does illustrate that separation between his parents, it also represents somewhat of a reconnection through the shared act of worship. This work has always felt deeply personal, and this trend continues in a small exhibition of his drawings currently on view at the museum, Shades of Life. Here's Ray with CMA curator Michael Neumeister talking about the exhibition during their interview last month.
You are working on installing another exhibition, right?
Or two,
or
well, 5.
I know it's not I know it suggested a finality, and I'm sorry about that. Yeah. But speaking specifically about Sigmund Abeles?
Sigmund Abeles, the show is up now in our Focus Gallery. So Sig Abeles, well, his family history is fascinating. He's born in Brooklyn to sort of like Orthodox Jewish parents. And his parents split up when he's pretty young, and he moves to Myrtle Beach with his mother, and she opens a rooming house. And I didn't realize before delving into his history that Charleston was such a significant landing place for expatriate Jews.
Wow.
In the 19th century. I had no idea. Well, there was a period of time where Charleston had basically more Jews than New York, and like it was the seat of the Jewish population in America at one time. So, his mother moves to Myrtle Beach, and this is, Sigmund Abeles is probably now in his late 80s or something. So at that time, as a kid in Myrtle Beach, there's really no art education, but maybe 15, 20 miles down the road, there's Brook Green Gardens. It's a sculpture garden in Murrells Inlet. And he just is taken by the sculptures there, and he starts sketching them. He's basically teaching himself to draw, and he's totally taken with Life magazine at that time. And they're reproducing the Sistine Chapel ceiling, of course, in these color spreads that are like, in the world before the internet, this is blowing people's minds.
Sure, yeah.
So he comes to the University of South Carolina in the 50s, and he's studying art there alongside Jasper Johns, who was a few years older than him, I believe. Sig Abeles was actually working at the Columbia Museum of Art, and in its early days, sort of just like pitching in at its old location, and he made friends with the exhibition designer and preparator or curator, or who knows. It was probably, I believe, David Van Hook was his name. He's an artist, an abstract artist in his own right, and he was, depending on what record you look at, he's the preparator, he's the designer, he's the curator, he's the registrar. Back then, he was everything. Right. Basically, he was putting the shows on the walls, unpacking them, and deciding where to hang them. And so Sig Abeles was working with him. He befriended him, and he got a little place in the attic. We were somehow affiliated with the Richland Art School. So I think the old Taylor House was the museum, and then on the grounds there was the Richland Art School. So they gave Sig Abeles a little space in the attic to work on student projects, basically. So he had this amazing relationship with Columbia, and of course he did his MFA at Columbia University in New York, and he's living in New York now, and he made his career elsewhere. He's been collected widely, but he always has this great relationship and affinity with us, and we actually have the largest holding of his graphic works anywhere in the world. So that was really fun to sort of dig to our holdings, and I was fortunate to speak with him and learn more about his work. And I think it's amazing that he was so committed to realism at a time of abstraction. I mean, that must have been so difficult moving to New York in the 1950s when,
right.
Like people wouldn't even look at you if you were working in a realist mode, and he was absolutely committed to it. And the fact that he stuck to it for all these years and is really an incredible draftsman. He also worked in sculpture, which I think is really interesting. He did work in pastel. He's a painter. We have one of his paintings pretty much on permanent view. It's always up. It's a small show, maybe 18 or 20 works, maybe even less actually, that shows his work, mostly just making works with friends and family as subjects, acquaintances, friends, family, self-portraits, things like that. Again, just sort of an intimate exhibition that we called Shades of Life, which is really nice. And I think he was really although he's not seen it yet, I sent him some pictures and he says he's really happy with it, which is the best compliment that any curator wants to hear, is that the artist is pleased with what you've done and your interpretation, because, that could always be dicey.
There's something powerful and maybe just a little uncomfortable about direct eye contact, isn't there? Many of the portraits in Shades of Life look directly back at the viewer, as if you were participating in an unwinnable staring contest. Much like his painting I talked about earlier, these drawings are creating a connection. But this time, it's between you as the observer and an assortment of the artist's family, friends, and acquaintances. These pictures put you in Abeles' perspective, looking back at the people that have been part of his life. It's interesting how much you can learn about artists, the lives they lead, their hopes and wants, values, just by looking at their work. A lot of what we do as a museum is this kind of interpretation, gleaning information about the lives of the artists, the time period, the place it was made through what we can see. But there are other ways to uncover facts about the past. Today's an exciting day because I don't usually get to talk to colleagues from other institutions. I'm really excited to bring on today's two guests. We have John Quirk and Graham Duncan, both from the South Caroliniana Library.
Hey, Drew.
Hey. It's so great to have y'all on the show. Libraries is something that I wish that I knew more about, and I hope that y'all can really help me gain a greater understanding today because, I'm pretty ignorant on the subject. I do read sometimes, but not very much. Can y'all tell me a little bit about yourselves and what you do there?
Sure, Drew. This is John Quirk. I'm a processing assistant at the South Caroliniana Library. I process mostly fine arts-oriented collections and recently worked on the Sigmund Abeles collection, and excited to be here to share some of that with you.
I'm Graham Duncan. I'm the head of collections and curator of manuscripts at the South Caroliniana Library. So I oversee kind of back of the house work on manuscript collections. So that's supervising folks engaged in the arrangement and description of manuscript collections. I also tend to be the primary kind of point of contact for potential collection donors, and then kind of help coordinate our efforts across the library for preservation, digitization, and that sort of thing.
What is the South Caroliniana Library? Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. Yeah, the South Caroliniana Library is one of the 5 special collections libraries at the University of South Carolina. We are part research library, part archive, and collect research materials related to the state of South Carolina and South Carolinians in a variety of formats. So manuscript materials, published materials, visual images.
How is that different from like a normal library? No, I know it sounds like a really, once again, ignorant questions are going to be coming from me, but when I think of a library, I think a lot of people have that generic idea of just like, a bunch of books. But a lot of what y'all hold in your collections is paperwork. It's physical, one-of-a-kind copies of things. Can you talk to me a little bit about how y'all's collection stands out in that way?
Yeah, like you say, I think most people's kind of perception of libraries is, rows of bookcases with books that you walk up and down, find one that you want to look at, check it out, take it home and read it. So we're a closed stack, non-circulating library. So you can't just walk in and browse our stacks, and you can't check things out and take them home with you. We do have a lot of primary source research material. So like you say, kind of one-of-a-kind materials, whether that's letters that somebody's written, diaries, photographic prints, that sort of thing. So while we do have rows and rows of books about the state of South Carolina, what really kind of sets us apart, and what sets really any kind of special collections library apart, is the unique one-of-a-kind materials that are there, generally primary source, so produced by the person who compiled the archive, rather than a historian's kind of take on the subject.
I would say that these collections take up a lot of room. They're in archival boxes, and they need special storage. And because of that, you really need the assistance of an archivist or someone in the reading room to access the materials for you, provide you space. And we need the reading room to always be manned because these materials are rare. It is different from a regular library in that way, too.
That's interesting because, as an art museum, we have a vault and collection storage. And now with ours, like, we have a very strict regulation on what the temperature needs to be at all times. Is it sort of similar for y'all?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, archival materials particularly, they're different kind of storage formats. But yeah, paper has a very specific kind of temperature and humidity level that it needs to be stored at. Color photographs have a very cold, temperature requirement that they need to be stored at. And particularly in our stacks area, our offsite storage facility, our vaults, those are all kept at fairly uncomfortable temperatures.
This is basically like a walk-in freezer is what you're telling me.
Yeah. Literally, literally the film library has a walk-in freezer for some of their films.
Yeah, and a bunker.
And a bunker, right, for the explosive ones.
For the explosive films, over out at Fort Jackson. So yeah, one of the other special collections libraries is the Moving Image Research Collections.
Is there anything that really stands out to you as like kind of like a showstopper? For us here, we have things like, we have the Botticelli painting, we have the Monet paintings, things that really shock people when they walk through the door. Do you have anything like that for y'all?
I guess one thing that comes to mind, one of my favorite collections, I didn't actually work on this, it's called the Joseph Winters Collections of Photographs. It's part of the visual collections at South Caroliniana. And Joseph Winters was a photographer here in Columbia, worked for the city in the 50s and 60s. And he photographed, documented the streets of Columbia, buildings, neighborhoods, almost house by house in some communities. And it's really fascinating to see how the city has evolved. And particularly, I'm fascinated by the photographs of what's called Ward 1, which is the area sort of where Colonial Life is, and the Coker Center, the Blatt PE Center, the areas surrounding USC now. And it's so interesting to look at those from the late 50s, even through the late 60s. In that area, the roads were still dirt roads, and there were dilapidated shacks that people were still living in. And it's really such a fascinating contrast to see that, and enlightening and sometimes disconcerting that it was not that long ago that that's what that area looked like. So I find that a very interesting collection, and it is accessible to your listeners. It's been digitized. So through USC's library website, you can see that and many other collections that have been digitized.
The big showstopper pieces at USC they end up at the rare books collection, right? They have the F. Scott Fitzgeralds and the Hemingways and all that kind of stuff. But I think that Caroliniana is really interesting and unique, and has kind of collections like Winter that John was talking about, and other collections that kind of place South Carolinians in places you might not expect, or kind of relationships you might not expect. The Caroliniana, we have, letters signed by a lot of presidents. We have, letters from George Washington to South Carolinians, that sort of thing. But I think I always like to show the day planners and day books of James T. McCain. So he was one of the few paid employees of CORE which was one of the big civil rights organizations in the country. And so we have his daily kind of calendars where he kept track of what he was doing. I mean, it's amazing. We think about the movement and the big kind of marches that were on television, or things like the Freedom Rides. She was intimately involved in planning through South Carolina, but kind of through his day-to-day work and the kind of calendars he kept, you got to see really the amount of work that went into something like the civil rights movement. And to have those calendars starting in 1957 for, I think, 16 straight years while he was working is really kind of an amazing look at not just South Carolina, but kind of the national civil rights movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the things when I stopped by a few weeks ago to meet with y'all in person. That was something that really touched me in a way that I wasn't expecting. Oftentimes, when you look at history, you look at it from sort of this like 1,000-mile view of like a historian's viewpoint on how things were and how things were seen later, right? But what y'all work with is a lot of stuff that at the time is sort of like a living history. It's those tangible things that actually help make that history and give it like a whole new perspective.
Yeah, it is kind of a completely different perspective on history than you get from, say, a published book, right? Any kind of published work of history worth its salt is going to be comprised of that historian's research into these primary source materials. But, they can never include everything, right? So, yeah, I mean, being able to work with those primary documents or photographs or whatever it may be that were produced by people at the time, not as historical artifacts necessarily, right? But just the kind of pieces that make up their day-to-day existence. A letter they sent. I mean, McCain, with the day books, I mean, he's simply doing that to be able to record his time that he was working, right? And the miles he traveled so he can get reimbursed. He probably did realize his place in the civil rights movement and had this larger place. But I mean, what the materials that he left behind are simply a kind of evidence of his existence. And yeah, it's fascinating. And I mean, it's fascinating to work with larger collections that have a lot of letters or a lot of diaries or materials in them from people that may not be alive anymore. They may not have been alive for 100 years, right? But you really feel like, oh God, I know this person now. I've been reading their mail for the last 6 months.
Yeah, it really does bring history to life. I mean, you're sitting there reading a letter that you have in your hand that someone wrote from the trenches in World War I to their mom and describing life in the camp and starving in the mud. And it just brings it to life in a way that a book can't possibly. You're holding what his pen went across. And I never get over that. It's a thrill so often. It's a great privilege and it's exciting, I find.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting, like, intimate way to kind of explore history, and this feels like a really natural transition. The exhibition that we have on view right now at the museum is called Shades of Life. It's a Sigmund Abeles exhibition. Why I think it's so interesting to pair kind of what y'all do and the work that y'all do with this is the exhibition itself is very intimate. Most of the subjects are his friends, his colleagues, family members. It's people that he knew personally. The sitters, they look directly back at the audience. So you're kind of looking at it from Sig's perspective, which I found to be really interesting and a compelling viewpoint to look at somebody's personal relationships, right? But y'all dig far deeper than that into his intimate history because you have an incredibly large archive of his personal papers, his correspondences, of basically everything. Can you talk to me a little bit about Sig's archive and how you've grown to have this massive collection of his personal paperwork?
Sure. The Tom Johnson, a former archivist at the South Caroliniana Library, was great with outreach and building relationships with various people in the community, particularly fine arts community. And he had started a correspondence with Sigmund Abeles years before, and the first archive deposit came in about 1988, I believe. And that was about three feet. So it was a small collection, and it's grown. When I started working with it, it was about 10 feet, linear feet. That's how we measure an archive, is how much space it takes on a shelf.
I was about to
That's
ask.
what we care about.
Yeah.
So I think 10 feet is about 8 archive boxes. And so now, after my last processing, it's grown to about 27 feet. And it's poised to grow. I think we maybe just got more today.
plus the 2.5 linear feet that showed up today, addressed to me from Sig. So
you're right. It's a significant size of a collection. It spans the gamut. And, your observations about Sig's work, his artwork being really intimate, is, I think, a hallmark of who he is, because his archive is the same. He let us take all of his letters, some of which are very personal, touching on challenging or difficult periods in his romantic relationships and in other aspects of his life that I'm not sure I'd be super comfortable sharing, but it shows his trust in us and his bravery, really. So, yeah, it's hard to work with sometimes those intimate letters and things, but it does give you a great insight.
The types of materials that he collects or gives to us that can kind of give us this intimate view into kind of the thinking behind his art is different than a politician or something like that, right? And I think he probably realizes that too, that, I mean, these kind of personal episodes in his life have influenced the kind of art he makes. And if he's interested in people knowing kind of the story behind the art he makes, you know, I think they have to have kind of an understanding of him that you can get through some of these things.
I know. Things were just getting good. Don't fret. I'll be right back with more from John and Graham after this. Hey y'all, you know who it is. Just thought you might like to know there's more coming soon. You know, more? What? You keep acting like you don't know what I mean. Come on. I'm talking about more exhibitions, more classes, more programs, more concerts, more tours, more art, more podcasts. There's always more at the CMA. See? More. And members get even more than that. More mission, more parties, more benefits than I can name in this ad. In fact, it might be easier if you just go see for yourself. Because if I have to list how much more there is, we'll be here all day. You can see more for yourself on our website, www.columbiamuseum.org. And now, for more of the show.
One, I think, particularly intimate grouping in the collection is a series of correspondences and records about a series of drawings he did called the Max drawings. He had a son, Max, who was born prematurely and had a real difficult few months in NICU in the hospital in New York. And Sigmund was there with his sketchbook every day, drawing these really heartrending images of his son. I don't know how he could do this. He's so emotionally attached. It must have been just how he worked through it. These are really intimate, personal drawings, and we don't have any of the actual original art, but we have a lot of records that relate to that and maybe a few sketches here and there. So that's a really intimate grouping, and it records his efforts to have a traveling exhibit of these drawings and work with doctors who specialize in premature births and do some fundraising and things. It's really a fascinating grouping. One thing that struck me, and I probably should have known this, I've known his work for a long time. I've known a little bit about him. I learned a lot more doing this process, but that he's so engaged politically. And there are a lot of correspondences with politicians and active efforts at lobbying and working with community groups in many ways. One comes to mind. He made a great effort to stop a nuclear power plant being built in New Hampshire on the coastline while he was working up in University of New Hampshire. And it was a great effort. There's a lot of documentation to that. And I believe they successfully stopped the creation of this power plant, which would have been really problematic on a very small coastline there. So his commitment and engagement in politics was a surprise to me. He's clearly passionate about that.
To me, it just seems so interesting to be able to have that kind of relationship with anything that personal. I mean, even someone as well established as Sig has to have a lot of confidence in order to just hand this material to somebody and be like, you take care of it. This is your problem now, With folks that you have this kind of relationship with, are a lot of them still with us today, or do you work more with materials of people that have previously passed? How common is it to have a working relationship with a living person of interest?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few people that we have relationships like that with, and they tend to be kind of public persona. But yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of the times I kind of think about, my own papers and my own correspondence and think, God, would I want that somewhere, particularly when I'm still alive, right? And so a lot of the times the collections do come to us when a person has passed. And a lot of the times we'll have established the relationship beforehand with them to put the paperwork in place to make sure that those materials come to us. But yeah, there are a couple of other folks that we're actively working with. Again, they tend to have very long-term relationships with the library. But yeah, a lot of the times it comes down to when someone has passed away and their children are cleaning out a house or something like that. And yeah, we're called to come take a look at things. But even then, I mean, children also have a real protective relationship with their parents' materials too. And, I don't want my parents' letters here and these kind of things. And so, yeah, it's always nice to have kind of some sort of MOU in place beforehand to know that, this is the wish of these people for their papers to come to the Caroliniana.
And so do y'all get a lot of cold calls? Do you get it? Really?
Yeah. We do get a lot of cold calls. Those tend to be from descendants of folks. Either their parents just passed or they're finally, selling their grandmother's house. But yeah, you'd be amazed. I'm always amazed at how much stuff is still out there, and like really old stuff that people just, call and think, gosh, how, there's even more. There's more out there. And,
Sig is pretty prolific in his note taking. Is that really common for some of the people that y'all work with, or just like when you are bequeathed a collection like that, is it usually like this in depth, or is this sort of an extreme case?
Yeah, I mean, as far as kind of a collection of personal papers and not, like a business collection or something like this is one of our larger collections. I mean, I think Sig is he writes a lot, and makes a lot of notes and that sort of thing. And we don't tend to weed really heavily, so I've always told donors to err on the side of caution. If you leave it in there, and we'll make a decision as to whether or not we think it belongs in there. I'd rather me give it back to you or dispose of it if you want me to, rather than you do it before it gets to me, and it could have been something that's helpful for someone. So yeah, I think those two things combined, our kind of light-handed weeding and Sig's willingness to share as much as possible, have led to this being a fairly large collection.
Yeah, I think that the ticket stubs are emblematic, and each one, or many of them, are annotated with when it was, who he was with, and gives a little review. And these are movies that he saw, plays, rock concerts, shows at galleries, and things like that. And the fact that he kept these, and we probably have maybe as much as 10 years worth of these stubs. When I first started going through these boxes and I saw these stubs, I thought, this is interesting. And I really was, do we want to save this? And as it grew, I thought, this is really quite fascinating to see what he did, where he went in this small little way. So that's just emblematic of his attention to details, note-taking, and just one example of why this collection is so big. But I think worth saving something like that. It's just unique.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by the ticket stubs and his collection, because, I mean, you expect, an artist who lives in New York City is going to art openings and theater and everything. But, he goes and sees, like, the latest blockbuster movies and will, make a little note on his ticket stub of what he thought about them. And there's a lot of them. Yeah, there are, 100 of them in a year. It's something when you kind of put them all together and you think of all the things and places he's been. This is a real kind of timeline of what he was doing that year. And you find ticket stubs and that sort of thing in collections a lot, but they tend to be, if somebody went to a premiere of a Broadway play that ended up becoming really popular, right, or the last big Thursday football game. We have tons, because everybody knew that was the last big Thursday football game, right? So we have tons of those tickets in our collection. So those things tend to be saved. But yeah, whatever summer blockbuster from 2009 that someone went and saw with a friend and then noted, not very good on it. Those you don't always get all of those. So.
And I think, one ticket stub is interesting, but it's in the collection, the aggregate of all these, and you see what he did over a 3, 4, 5 year period. It's just fascinating. As a grouping, it's really interesting.
Yeah, when we had the Van Gogh exhibition here, it was comprised of about 9 Van Goghs and then a bunch of artists that Van Gogh either interacted with or liked or didn't like, And I think a lot of people held a lot of umbrage to the fact that we would put up paintings by people that he did not like. But I always make this argument that inspiration is both what you really love and what you really hate, because both give you a direction of where you want to go. I think this whole thing with the ticket stubs is a very similar sort of mentality of you can't know what you like unless you know what you don't like.
Right.
And we get an interesting insight where we get to see both ends of that spectrum for him personally. And yeah, he's not a filmmaker, right? But creative arts inspire each other in different ways. And I'm sure that even in very small ways, him going to these movies, going to see Spider-Man 3 or whatever, has left some sort of effect on him, whether intentional or not. Now, since y'all are a research library, I would assume a lot of people are coming there because they have a goal in mind. So who are y'all usually building these collections for? Who's the standard person that kind of comes in looking for research on a subject, that kind of stuff?
Our primary user base tends to be historical researchers. So whether they're professors working on volumes of history, PhD students working on dissertations, those tend to be our primary users and have been historically. I mean, we are one of the premier kind of research archives in the Southeast for sure, but really in the nation. So we're kind of on that tour of archives that you have to visit if you're writing about Southern history. We're particularly strong in 19th century materials, but we are kind of actively building collections, more modern collections, more diverse collections, that sort of thing, to make sure that we are kind of fulfilling our mission to document the state of South Carolina in its entirety. But we really are and will be more when we move back into the renovated building, trying to engage with the undergraduate population at USC more than we have historically in the past. More professors and instructors want students, definitely by the college level, to have had interactions with primary source material and know how to use them and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think the future is bright with that. We'll have an actual classroom space in the building when we move back in, and that'll really give us the chance to teach more with our collections the way some of our colleagues do.
Yeah, I was about to say, when do you move back in the building? Because I know y'all have been kind of displaced for the time being and are sort of just working where you can within USC's many library compounds. But when do you get to go back to your own physical space?
Yeah, so we'll be moving collections back in this winter and should be reopening in the building on the Horseshoe in January. We'll have kind of a shakedown period in the first few weeks of the year to make sure all the systems are operating correctly. But yeah, and then hopefully by the end of January, we have researchers back in there and we're planning a kind of a grand reopening celebration. But nobody's worked in there since 2016. So it's a big renovation, but it was credit to library administration to making sure that the renovation was done correctly. I mean, it's an 1840 building that had never really had a major renovation since the 1920s. So it was, important to do it correctly. And if that meant it took a little longer than we had hoped, that'll be okay.
Finally going to get some electricity in there.
Yeah, right. Yes, exactly.
Stop researching by candlelight.
Yeah, well, no flame was ever allowed in the building. Given the college rules, no fire in the building.
Is that right?
It's got those 3 massive skylights on the second floor, those big monitors. So those provide the majority of the light. It'll be nice when we move back in there because the lighting that they've reinstalled in there is going to be very minimal. Most of the artificial light is only going to come from tabletop lamps. So we're going back to using the natural light in the huge arch windows and the skylights for most of the light in the second floor. Yeah, more of a feeling of how the building was intended to be used in the 19th century.
Speaking kind of the future of the museum, I mean, y'all are in the 21st century. You have a digitized collection. How much of your collection is available digitally? Because I was doing a little perusal earlier, and then I kind of just went down a rabbit hole that didn't end. So I have an assumption that it's quite a bit.
We've got a lot up there, but if I had to guess, I would say less than 10% of our collection's available digitally. I mean, it's just a very minute amount.
I think that's pretty much digital collections across the board. it's the tip of an iceberg because it's hard to justify digitizing everything. It takes a lot of work, a lot of manpower to do the catalog in the back end and to maintain the digital files. You're constantly copying them to new resources and preserving the digital files too. So there's an expense to that.
Preservation is never free, right? That's
Exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I mean, I think John knows this better than I do. He works a lot with digital collections, but the kind of what you see on the front end when you look at digital collections is really the smallest amount kind of time and work that's gone into doing that. I mean, the creating of metadata about the object you're seeing, the preservation kind of back end of it is really a lot of work.
It's labor intensive, definitely.
I just don't think people realize that. I mean, you just scan it and you put it up. Well, I mean, just scanning a handwritten letter and putting it online, maybe you've saved a trip for somebody into the library, but you haven't really made that item any more usable than it was in a folder in the library without the descriptive data about that letter. What are you looking at?
Sure. That makes a lot of sense, and as someone who has delved in and worked in databases in the past, for me, it's just like an image archive, but yeah, it's a nightmare sitting there and metadata tagging everything. People don't recognize the amount of work that somebody will put in to make it convenient for them, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, they just realized that they've found it. And, how did you find it? I guarantee you didn't go through the front door of this database and look at everything until you found the thing that is of use to you, right? No, you did a keyword search somewhere and went straight to the thing that you needed.
And so next time any of our listeners at home are at a library, be sure to thank the librarian because they're the ones doing that work for you to make it actually tangible and be able to find what you're looking for, or else you just have a room full of papers and books,
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. Well, I mean it. With this kind of idea of like moving into the 21st century of archives, what's like the next step of like, what will we kind of be archiving from today?
Yeah, that's tough. That's something that we talk about a lot at the library. I think that for a long time to come, we will get manuscript collections that are found in somebody's barn or something. We'll process those. But I think increasingly the day of finding a cache of letters in your grandmother's attic are gone, and everything now is being produced digitally. So collections do come in with more and more digital materials, hard drives, floppy disks, digital photos. But we worry really about this current time. What's not being saved? Is the future going to see a big black hole when they try to write our history? It's really hard to say what we're losing. But I know that the stuff that would have been saved through pure happenstance or serendipity, like those letters in your grandmother's attic, are not. And so we really have to be cognizant of that and make plans to save things. I don't know the answer, but that's something we worry about.
Yeah, because I know with my correspondences, they're very ephemeral, right? It's like an email. And then I don't even keep my emails forever. Right. At a certain point, like Gmail tells me I can't hold anymore. Right. And then I just start deleting years worth of correspondences. And sometimes that comes back and bites you because you realize you really needed something from 3 years ago and it's gone. I could see how that could be a big concern because I think a lot of people are probably a lot more like me, where they don't keep records of these sort of things.
Yeah, I think for extremely public figures, government figures and that sort of thing, they're kind of modern political happenings aside. Public figures are mandated to keep their records, right? And there are laws in place. So I think in that way, that we do have access to kind of the top level kind of governmental working or kind of government agency working, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think as someone who works in an archive that does not collect materials in the state record, right? The South Carolina Department of Archives and History is the official repository for state records. So the things at the Caroliniana are personal papers. And yeah, there's no mandate out there that says you have to keep your personal papers. Of course, not everyone kept their personal papers in the past either, but the idea, like John said, that you may hold on to a set of letters that, may have been written during a particular time period, I don't know, your courtship or when, your significant other was off at war. The chances of you holding on to those specific things are greater. And yeah, today, it's easier just to get rid of the emails that you don't need anymore than to take the time to move those all over into a hard drive that you then carefully preserve, and back up every X number of years to make sure that you don't lose your correspondence. And honestly, I mean, email is probably the most saved form of digital correspondence. I mean, think about texting. So, right, I mean, you're talking about like the ephemeral nature of correspondence. I mean, email at least is there for the most part that you might be able to pull it back. I mean, but how do you find a text message that you sent? And even if you can, to libraries, how do we preserve all of your text messages? But yeah, I mean, I think it's the challenge we all face now.
So when I find a big box of sales receipts from 1910, and I go, the South Caroliniana Library really needs these. What do I do as like Joe Schmo in the street to like contact y'all to get y'all to come take a look at this?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way, I mean, my contact information's on the Caroliniana's website, my phone number, my office phone, and my email. I'm the one as the head of collections that gets to deal with those questions. I have calls literally every day from people, either about new things they found or continuing conversations with other people. So yeah, I'm happy to get a call, get an email.
So if you got something cool, call Graham.
Yeah.
If you don't have something cool, maybe call him anyway.
Call me anyway. And I mean, I have learned to say no diplomatically throughout my career. And really, honestly, I've found that most people are okay with you saying no if it's really not something that belongs in our library or that doesn't have a lot of research value. I have found that people, for the most part, are really good about just wanting to make sure somebody doesn't want it before they throw it away. They just want someone else to tell them it's okay to get rid of this mass market paperback book, that you have. And that's fine. I'm happy to do that too.
Well, there's only so many feet on the shelf.
Right.
John Quirk and Graham Duncan, both from the South Caroliniana Library at the University of South Carolina. If you want to learn more about the library or browse its digital collections, we'll have information and links in the show notes. Well, here we are at the end of my very scripted takeover of Binder Podcasts. This has been an interesting experience for me personally, but I feel obligated to add a little caveat to the end of the episode. I've been looking at Mr. Abeles' work from a lot of different lenses, my own first impressions, curated interpretations, other people's conversations, his personal documents, and I really do feel like I've learned a lot about him. But do I really know who he is now? No. I mean, I don't think so. I recorded an interview with a different artist many years ago, and this thing she says always stuck out to me. Basically, it paraphrased to, if you want to know someone, you gotta take the time and listen to them. Seems obvious, but if you think about it, those two things can be some of the hardest to do. Learning about a person solely through their output will certainly give you glimpses into who they are, but only he knows his real story, just like only you know yours or I know mine. That being said, exposure to that distinct perspective can change your own. At the end of the day, you may look at his work and see something completely different from anything we've spoken about today. But that's okay. In fact, that's pretty cool. I may not know everything about Mr. Abeles in his life just by looking at what he makes or leaves behind, but experiencing it has left something with me. And hey, who knows? It's still not too late to get it from the source, so Mr. Abeles, if you're listening, give us a call. We'd love to have you on the show. You've been listening to Binder, a production of the Columbia Museum of Art. Today's episode was produced, hosted, and edited, for better or worse, by me, Drew Barron. Special assistance from Joel Ryan Cook. The idea for today's episode was brought to me by my good friend, colleague, and one of the friendliest faces you'll meet at the museum, the CMA's Visitor Experience and Communications Manager, Erica Von Schenk.
You're welcome, Drew.
Thanks, Erica.
I love making connections in this city and bringing friends to the museum.
You heard it here first. For more information about Binder, CMA exhibitions, and programs, visit our website, www.columbiamuseum.org. Brigitte will be here next week. Ray and I will be back next month.
Thanks, Drew. It's great to be at the Binder World Headquarters here for once.